It has been a while since I posted my last Summoner's War guide, but with the recent PvE content updates introducing new rewards that are basically game changing across each stage of every player's progression, I think it's a good time for me to get back into my educational content.
So it's our responsibility to educate.
In today's video we will be talking about the Ellunia dimension, more in particular the B5 of the Rune dungeon that drops the newest rune grade of ancient runes, grinds and enchantments for a handful of sets in exchange for one-dimensional whole energy, which is passively collected every 2 hours on your account, or you can also buy some weekly refills which net you an extra 10 energy up to 3 times. In today's video we will be discussing why you should be farming this dungeon in the first place, or when it is best for you to invest your dimensional energy in other ways. We will also discuss every stage of the actual boss fight, and after we're done with that we will go more into depth when it comes to team building for beginners, for auto teams, and also when it comes to speed teams. I'm gonna give you guys some tips. Like always, I'm gonna have some timestamps in my pinned comment and also on the screen right now in case you can't be bothered to watch the entire video. The dimensional hole is by far the most endgame part of PvE progression in Summoner's War currently. So the question if you should be farming the dungeon really doesn't come up for many players. The only thing that you really have to decide is between Fairy or the Beast dungeon, which both drop very different rune sets and therefore kind of encourage different playstyles overall. Also, from what I can tell, the Beast dungeon is a lot easier to beat for newer players, but harder to get 100% success rate for. So I will be definitely also posting a second episode about that dungeon really soon, so definitely just make sure to be subscribed with notifications on to never miss one of my next guides. Either way, farming in Summoner's War is very time consuming and the drop rates for endgame stuff is just normally completely horrible. So because of that reason, why not just stay tuned to this guide. For now, it doesn't really matter too much, 1 or 2 weeks of farming either one of those dungeons. It's really not going to improve your account by a huge margin, but you will definitely eventually see your improvements, trust me on that one. After you clear 2 waves of really weak monsters that are basically just there to kind of waste your time, no more! You will actually end up facing off with the fairy boss of the Ellunia dimension. In this guide I want to break down the mechanics of this boss fight in 3 different phases. Basically every time he revives, every time the boss dies, he will spawn another 2 monsters with him and also change his skill set. An additional note is that every time he dies, his attack bar does not get reset after all, so potentially that would lead to a boss just attacking right after you kill him, which is definitely something that you want to take into consideration. On top of all of that, the boss also gets an additional turn for every one of his allies that you kill, and also his speed gets increased by every turn that your team moves. So as you guys can see, that's a lot of different stuff that is gonna happen just right away in every one of the stages. But now let's talk about stage 1, which is by far the easiest, with both monsters being basically just supports and kind of just indirectly strengthening with their heals and buffs. The attack order that I would recommend is gonna be going for the left monster first, that would be a Shannon, and then attacking the boss, or just going for the boss right away if you got enough damage in your team comp. I mean, especially for speed teams, you mostly just aim for the boss in the first place. The attack bar after you kill the boss really doesn't matter too much. The second phase isn't that tough because of that reason, but I want to talk about that right now. So in the second phase, the boss is spawning a relatively undangerous Dryad and an insanely scary Fire Druid. Which you will most likely have attribute disadvantage against if you're running a wind team, which most people do when it comes to slow teams. Basically, he will cause a lot of trouble if you mostly just stack supports. If that wasn't bad enough, crowd controlling that druid really doesn't work too well either, because the dryad of course also cleanses sometimes, which frees the druid up to do druid things, which mostly is just derping. But every other run when he doesn't get killed fast enough or get CC'd, he will just armor break you and either just one-shot you right there and then, or just leave you open to the boss's one shot. In general, the healing that you need in that stage is just completely overwhelming, and if you don't bring immunity, this phase could actually wipe you even harder than the third one. So in this stage, I would say that the attack order is something like going for the druid first, and then just focusing on the boss. The druid really doesn't do much if the druid is already down. When it comes to the attack bar, I would actually highly recommend being cautious on that one, since the third stage boss fight, he actually just one-shots you right away, especially if your team is already at low HP or you already used your revives. The main reason for that is because stage 3 is by far the toughest out of all of the 3 stages in this boss fight, especially if you combine it with the RNG of the previous stages. So you basically have to deal with 2 nukes, a cleanse, a attack buff, and you kind of just get overwhelmed by so much damage and so many turns. Derps always do happen. Monsters sometimes just use their first skills, and you will definitely fall behind in the first couple of turns in this fight. So those 2 stages are kind of the reason why having a 100% success rate team composition is really hard to actually pull off, and I want to talk a little bit about team building right now. So I hope this overview was helpful, and with all of that theory out of the way, let's start talking about team building. Like every one of the dimensional hole dungeons, the fairy dungeon has an additional condition for team building, which would be mono element, which basically already narrows down your options to either water or wind teams. One of my close friends, Vili, is farming this dungeon with a light team, so if you own a Shan, this might also be an alternative. But with all of that salt aside, premium monsters are a constant in this dungeon. You will have a very hard time building teams with just easy to obtain monsters. So maybe for beginners, it is probably best to just stick to the beast dungeon instead. But thanks for sticking with me and giving me some additional watch time. Fuck, now I do feel bad. I'm telling you what. I think we're gonna start off by discussing free-to-play monsters at first, and then we're gonna talk about advanced strategies and speed teams later on. One of the main reasons why I think that it is almost impossible to clear this dungeon with pure free-to-play monsters is just the lack of viable revivers that are in wind or water teams when it comes to easy to obtain monsters. With the water Undyne as a fusible option, I think she is one of the most overlooked supports out there, with a really good leader skill, an awesome skill set for the second stage of the boss fight, and remember when I talked about the fire druid being dangerous? Well, forget all of that. She practically nullifies whatever he is trying to do to your team. But the issue with that is locking yourself into the water element doesn't really help too much with viable free-to-play monster alternatives. You kind of understand where I'm coming from right there, so that's the reason why it's very hard to build free-to-play teams. What I would just do is run double twins and maybe a Emma with that sort of team composition, and you should be good to go like that. When it comes to free-to-play supports in win teams, I think you got a lot more variety to choose from. I personally love using Mav for the leader skill, plus the provoke that technically doesn't glance on the fire druid. Or I've also tried it a little bit with Bernard if I was lacking defense break in my team comps for a little bit more of an offensive playstyle. I'm also experimenting with Delphoy as my healer to passively deal with the druid by either just resetting him or using immunity on my team. And when it comes to revivers, I love using Eladriel and Tyrannus, which I think are probably the best monsters for this dungeon when it comes to slow teams and having a high success rate. In addition to that, the synergy between Tyrannus and Ramahan is pretty strong, so if you're looking for a secondary awakening to use in this dungeon and you have a Tyrannus, I can just highly recommend using those together. But I do also actually think that if you don't have any other alternatives, Ramahan should do the job even without armor buff. So as you can tell, there are a lot of different options out there. At the end of the day, I would just recommend having at least one HP leader skill, at least one healer, at least one way to deal with the fire druid, and some revivers in your team comps. The way I see it, it just depends on how much time you have on your hands on a daily basis. I would even recommend for mid-game players to start building these teams, especially when you own those 2 revivers that I talked about earlier. If you do not, kind of just expect a success rate of like roughly 80% on auto teams. The safest team that I personally have been trying out was actually with those 2 units. I was using Eladriel, Marth, Tyrannus and Ramahan, which has not failed me ever since I started using it. And even if you fail, I think it is worth considering to revive. I know it's like really expensive, but that's just my personal opinion, which comes from like a free-to-play endgame player who doesn't really summon that much. Like if you think about it, this game is basically just all about runes nowadays, and having those ancient rune grades definitely does give you the edge. So while it is definitely something that you want to avoid failing too many times, I think reviving every once in a while is definitely something that you should be considering. Since it is pretty hard and monster dependent to get a safe fairy dungeon team, many players actually just opt to go for speed teams instead, which might have slightly less successful rates, but require way less time and effort team building wise, since most endgame players do already have a galleon and twins built in 2019. I personally do not use this strategy, but one of my fellow content creator friends, Foxy, just kinda allowed me to let me use some clips from his guide just for completion's sake. Those are the stats that he utilizes on those monsters.
I just slapped a bunch of random runes on it.
I don't know what this is, but it's kinda hot.
Of course he just focuses on the actual boss, he doesn't really focus on any of the ads. And even with those godlike stats, the success rate of these runs is like just abysmal, so you guys really expect like a success rate of like roughly 70% when using this strategy, which is something that I personally don't really like. But if you don't have that much time on your hand but still want to get your hands on a bunch of those new runes, this is just a strategy that I've also been seeing people utilize. And yeah, I think that's gonna be it for today's guide. It took me like a week to edit this video, so if you found it helpful, also make sure to leave a like. No, but seriously, like, it's for free and it does help my videos perform in the YouTube algorithm. If you want to get in touch with me, just check out the description and all of the links to my social media. And until then, see you guys in the next video. Bye!